How the 2020 economic collapse will differ from the 2008 financial crisis. The U.S. economy is going through the biggest economic meltdown for the first time in many decades. The Great Depression is the only time we saw this level of economic fallout. At the moment, many businesses have been closed. The stock market has been on a free fall. Millions of Americans have been laid off. The number of unemployed people has been skyrocketing. The whole economic setup has been interrupted. We have a health problem and an economic collapse at the same time, and this makes the economic crisis very different to what we had during the 2008 global financial crisis. Here are some of the major differences between the current economic meltdown and the 2008 global financial crisis. 1. Fed's interest rates. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve had a 500 basis points margin to lower interest rates as a way of stimulating the economy. This enabled them to lower rates from 5% all the way to 0. However, at the moment, the Fed only had a margin of 160 points. They've already slashed the rates to 0. Traditionally, the Federal Reserve can lower or increase interest rates as a way of managing the economic cycle. Low interest rates means it'll be cheaper to borrow money. If people borrow money, spending increases, and this results in an economic expansion. The opposite happens when the Fed increases the interest rates. This is the core thing in initiating monetary policies and regulating levels of credit in the economy. In recent days, the United States economy has been performing poorly because of disruption in global supply chains. At the same time, businesses across the United States have been closing. Recent data shows that the U.S. economy has been slowing very fast. This is what has prompted the Fed to lower the interest rates all the way to 0 as a way of boosting the declining economy. This was necessary because economists are predicting that the recent economic fallout will be several times bigger than the 2008 global financial crisis. 2. Quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is not complicated as it sounds. It means printing money out of thin air and then pumping this money to the economy. This is a monetary policy which the Fed initiates in circumstances where lowering interest rates is not enough to stimulate a declining economy. Usually, money is created if banks issue loans at various specified interest rates, and this is the basis of the current debt-driven monetary system that runs our economy. Debt is created once credit is issued, but this system has its own shortcomings. But it has been effective in protecting the economy from inflation because money is given out for specified purposes. This does not directly affect the price of various commodities, but when done excessively, it creates debt bubbles like the housing market bubble in 2008. These bubbles are very dangerous to the economy because if they're not managed well, they'll always cause a financial crisis, as happened back in 2008. If not done well, quantitative easing can easily cause inflation. This is the reason why in 2008 only predetermined financial institutions and banks benefited from the program. If everyone is given the quantitative easing money, there will be a major risk of inflation. This will not necessarily improve the condition of the economy, just like happened with the Swedish paper money in the 17th century. In the 2008 economic meltdown, the Bush administration initiated a $700 billion bill to bail out banks as a way of stimulating the economy. It worked very well. The U.S. economy remained stable until 2019 when the Fed announced a $60 billion quantitative easing program because they had anticipated economic fallout in 2020. This was a way of cushioning the economy before the crash happened, but no one knew that the crash would be triggered by this health problem. For the last 2 months, the U.S. economy has been performing very poorly. The stock market has currently lost more than 30% of its value. Experts are warning that the worst is yet to come. This economic meltdown has forced the Federal Reserve to start the biggest quantitative easing program in American history. This is because the U.S. economy is going through an economic crisis that experts are warning that will be bigger than the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve injected $700 billion into the financial markets at the first phase of the program, and late on $1.5 trillion was given to the banks. Last week, President Trump signed the historic stimulus package worth $2 trillion, of which $250 billion will be given to families and individual workers. These numbers are historical. At the moment, we're talking about a quantitative easing program that's close to $5 trillion. All this cash has been injected into the American economy. Many experts are worried that this is going to cause inflation, or at least the dollar might lose its value. 3. American elections. In 2008, when the economic crisis started getting out of hand, Obama had already won the Democratic Party nominations. At the same time, the divide between the Republicans and the Democrats was not as severe as it is at the moment. This time, the Democrats have a big hatred of Trump to a point where they're demonizing his leadership. Furthermore, for the first time, the Democrats have Bernie Sanders as their candidate. He is the first candidate who has socialist ideas within a capitalist America. Because of the recent health problems and economic meltdown, it's unclear if the presidential elections will be held on time, or whether the general elections will be delayed. In a nutshell, this is the time when America is so divided for the first time since the Civil War. The 2008 economic meltdown is still fresh in the minds of most Americans, and we have a presidential candidate who is against bailing out the big corporations. This is a complex situation, and the future remains uncertain. 4. Global health problems. The Federal Reserve had already begun the quantitative easing program in 2019. This means that they were anticipating for an economic crisis. But little did they know that what they were preparing for would be triggered by a global health problem. Their actions were within the 10-year period economic cycle, where the economy booms for 8 to 10 years, and this is later followed by an economic decline. Since the 2008 global financial crisis, the U.S. economy has been booming, and about 10 to 11 years later, an economic crisis is here again. Now, this is normal in the U.S. economy, but this time it is very complicated because of this global health problem and a global economic crisis are both happening at the same time. Unlike the collapse of the housing market in 2008, this time the health problem has slowed economic activities all over the world. Supply chains have been severely disrupted. Airlines are suspending their flights. Many businesses are being closed across the United States and the world. 5. The rise of China. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we now have another global power that's challenging the United States, and China seems to be doing pretty well. China has already managed to control this health issue. They're already establishing diplomatic relationships by helping European countries solve their health problems. On top of this, President Xi Jinping was allowed to be the Chinese president for life. This is totalitarianism, but it will help China in executing their long-term strategies. China is gaining soft power at the expense of the collapsing American empire. However, Americans are waking up to this reality, and this has forced President Trump to begin the trade war. The future of U.S.-China relationships remains uncertain even during this period of tremendous health and economic challenges. 6. Short-term versus long-term debt crisis. Just like the economy works in cycles, debt is also cyclic. Borrowing continues to a point where no more debt can be taken. It reaches a point where all those debts just have to be paid. During this economic meltdown, we have a lot of debt, much more than we had in the 2008 global financial crisis. We're at a point where we cannot take any more debt, and instead, we have to pay the current outstanding debt. and this means that the US economy will have to contract. This has been factored into the current economic fallout, which experts are warning that can turn out to be a depression if things are not addressed on time. It's very clear we're living in extremely difficult economic times. We have a historic level of economic meltdown. Experts are warning that the worst is yet to come. This is the biggest economic crisis in many years, and it can only be compared with the Great Depression. In less than 2 months, millions of Americans have lost their jobs. Hundreds of companies have been forced to shut down their operations. The global health problem that we're all going through is making the economic meltdown much more severe and makes it totally different to the 2008 financial crisis. The US government should focus on solving this health problem because it is the only solution if the economy is to open up in the near future.